Weapons of precise destruction. Israel accuses Iran of building missile factories in Syria. Will it draw them into the war next door? I'm Imran Garta, and today's Newsmaker is Israel's strategy on Syria. Israel believes Iran poses perhaps the greatest threat to its existence. There's a deep-held fear, and not without reason, that Iran wants to wipe the Israeli state from the pages of history. And now Israeli authorities accuse Iran of being one step closer to that objective. Israel says that new satellite pictures prove Iran is building advanced weapons factories inside Syria, similar to ones in Tehran. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says it's an unacceptable threat and that he's prepared to take action to stop it. Starting on Tuesday, Israel began flexing its military muscle by conducting its biggest military exercise in decades to simulate war with the Iran-backed group Hezbollah in Lebanon. Israel has largely kept out of the war in Syria, but now one official is quoted as saying if Iran expands its presence there, Israel will bomb Assad's presidential palace. So, what impact would Israeli intervention have? We begin our debate with this report from Vanessa Keneally.
A firm handshake, and then it was straight down to business. The Israeli Prime Minister wasted no time warning UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres about his country's forever foe.
Iran is busy turning Syria into a base of military entrenchment, and it wants to use Syria and Lebanon as war fronts against its declared goal to eradicate Israel. It is also building sites to produce precision-guided missiles towards that end in both Syria and in Lebanon.
Netanyahu was referring to this picture provided to him by an Israeli satellite company. Local analysts say it's identical to a similar site that they believe is located inside Iran. The Israeli Prime Minister said it's proof Tehran is preparing to build weapon factories in Syria's northwestern region, a claim he's made before, but now he wants the world to know. As well as meeting the UN Secretary General, he's met President Vladimir Putin in Moscow to deliver exactly the same message: Iran is the enemy. Israel has largely stayed out of its neighbour's backyard for the past 6.5 years of war in Syria. But in recent months, several incidents have forced it to become involved. Like in March, when Syrian state media reported regime forces had shot down an Israeli jet flying in its airspace over Palmyra, Israel denies the claim. And then in April, Syria's military said Israel shot down a projectile southwest of Damascus International Airport. But it was a stray rocket into Israel's territory in June that provoked the most direct and focused response yet.
המדיניות שלנו ברורה, איננו מקבלים טפטוף מכל סוג שהוא. לא מרגמות, לא רקטות, לא זליגת ירי, מכל סוג שהוא, בכל חזית שהיא. אנחנו מגיבים בעוצמה על כל פגיעה בשטחנו או באזרחינו.
But Israel's real beef isn't with Syria. It's with Iran and Hezbollah, who both fight alongside Assad's forces. Israel says Tehran is providing Hezbollah with better weapons for its next war against it, and believes Tehran is deliberately arranging ceasefires in de-escalation zones in southern Syria, so it will have a stronger presence near Israel's borders. So could this mean that if Iran is indeed inching closer to Israel's front door, it will step outside and meet the threat head-on? Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined from Tel Aviv by Ksenia Svetlova. She's a member of Israel's parliament with the opposition Zionist Union Party. And in Washington, D.C., we have a former military intelligence officer and current senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, Michael Pregent. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. Ksenia Svetlova, let me begin with you. These satellite images that are causing a fuss right now, do they tell you what Prime Minister Netanyahu says they should tell you?
Absolutely, absolutely. We are very much concerned by what is going on in Syria and also in Lebanon within the frame of expansion of the Iranian interests there, and especially of the creating of new facilities for the creation of rockets. So this is definitely something that should be a red line for all of us here in Israel, never mind if it's coalition or opposition. And I think that in this regard, the Prime Minister should be even more perhaps concerned than he is. He raised this issue with Vladimir Putin, President of Russia, but then we never saw a continuation. We never saw a reply. We never saw that Putin indeed believes that just like us that these plants should not be stationed in Syria. That this is a threat to regional security.
Okay, and I'm going to broaden it out to Russia in a few minutes' time, but I want to kind of stay focused with regards to the intentions of the Iranians for the moment. Michael Pregent, why can't it be no more than the Iranians just shoring up their support for Bashar al-Assad, where they've intervened, they've decided to back him, and these are the fruits of them backing him as they try to ensure that he wins the war? Why can't it be just that?
Well, because we have to pay attention to what Iran is doing. They've tried to smuggle these rockets across Iraq through Syria and into Lebanon, and now they've actually been able to, they've come to the conclusion that why smuggle them when we can simply build them here in Syria? These are definitely the rewards of supporting Assad, and also the rewards of partnering with Russia in Syria. Again, Russia's moving air defense assets into these areas where these factories are being built, these factories to produce precision surface-to-surface missiles. And of course, Israel should be concerned, as should the United States and the rest of the international community, that Iran plans to increase Hezbollah's capability to punish Israel if Iran is attacked for their nuclear program or if Iran is attacked for anything else. This is the response that they want the international community and the U.S. to weigh. What is the response from Iran if Iran is attacked for militarizing its nuclear program? And the conclusion by most analysts that cover the Middle East is Hezbollah will punish Israel. Well, this increases or enhances Hezbollah's ability to do that.
So, Ksenia Svetlova, you're in the opposition, but, this is a national security issue here, part of national defense, and a lot of the time people on both sides of the aisle then come together. What's the end game here then? If all sides within Israel, regardless of the political divide, consider the Iranian influence in Lebanon and Syria as escalating, does that mean that all sides would support an escalation from the Israeli side? Does that mean Israel getting, let's start with Syria first. Is Israel going to get more involved in Syria and get sucked into that war?
Well, Israel tried its best for the last 6 years not to get involved in the Syrian crisis. We are right that we are sitting on the borders, we are very close to Syria, but however, we tried our best not to be driven into this bloody conflict and to, as far as we can, to stay away from it. However, now I believe, and so do many experts here in Israel, that it's beginning increasingly difficult, not only when we see the satellite images of the plants, where Scud missiles will be created and produced, but also given that the current agreement on the de-escalation zones in southern Syria, which basically allow Iran to get closer to our borders with the proximity of 3-4 miles. So, if you ask me, then of course, as a member of Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, I would tell you that the last thing that I want is to drag our country into some kind of war and to destabilize, the regional security and to destabilize again the situation here in the Middle East. I would prefer an international action because I believe that no country, in fact, gains from Iran acquiring new bases here in Syria and also in Lebanon. I think that all of the Gulf countries, of course, should fear this moment. All of the Arab Sunni countries, I think also Turkey, should be very, very concerned by what is going on because we are speaking about very fragile relations, with Ankara. So I think that, also the United States, of course, the European Union, should do everything possible to, first of all, try to drive some kind of international action against that. And if it will not be successful, then, perhaps we'll have to resort to some other means.
Michael Pregent, isn't there a paradox here in the sense that a few years ago, the war was far worse and there was less of a threat to the Israelis, I guess, because when the war gets simmered down, it involves bringing in the Iranians, it involves bringing in the Russians, and involves maybe possibly having to accept that Assad gets to stay. So is the paradox that then that peace would be bad for Israel, which would ignite more war?
Well, based on your question, if you look at Iran's actions after the Iran deal, the JCPOA, it basically emboldened their activities. It allows them to shore up Assad in Syria. And then Qasem Soleimani went to Moscow to invite Russia in to Syria. So Iran has actually stepped up its activities, and those activities have actually benefited Assad. He looks more entrenched now. The international community is starting to say that it may not be a matter of fact that Assad has to go, that maybe there is a way for him to stay, and I think that's where everybody's leaning at this point. The issue here with Iran is Iran's strategic calculus is to have this land bridge, you know, through Tehran, Baghdad, Damascus, and into Lebanon, to be able to threaten Israel. The calculus is that if they actually look like a legitimate threat to Israel, somehow that might push Sunni Arab countries back into their sphere of influence, meaning that Iran has actually demonstrated a capability to threaten Israel, and therefore it might unite the Arab countries behind Iran. That's their strategic calculus. So we need to do something now before they get to that point.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Ksenia, let me then ask you about Lebanon. How likely do you think that there'll be another war?
Well, until very recently, I think every single expert in Israel that you would ask where the next war will erupt would tell you that it would not come from the south, it will come from the north. So there is a probability. We do understand that Hezbollah was also weakened by its prolonging participation in the Syrian conflict. So it perhaps might not be the immediate wish of this murderous terrorist organization to start a war against Israel. However, if we would see the continuation of leaking of the strategic weapons to this organization, this is what we see now. We are being briefed also by our sources and by our intelligent communities that Hezbollah is now laid its hands on the Yahond missiles, earth to sea. So this is something that changed the equation altogether. So I would tell you that we are the last party that is interested in having some kind of warfare now in the region. However, you know, it seems that the increasing of Hezbollah ability and the new reality with having plans to produce weapons, Iranian weapons, so close to our borders. We are talking about, you know, a few miles after all, that it completely changes the equation.
Let me bring in a dissenting voice now. Joining us from Jerusalem is Amir Oren. He's from Haaretz newspaper, and he writes about defense and the government. Amir, you're hearing the other two guests saying here that Iran is an existential threat. It's shoring itself up in Syria. It's beefing itself up and targeting its military might towards Israel. The Israelis are conducting a massive military drill. It's no joke. It's the biggest in 2 decades and will go on for 10 days. The message to be sent to Hezbollah and Nasrallah. Is it justified, Amir?
Well, one should look at it proportionately. First of all, the existential threat posed by Iran is dormant now and will be dormant for the next 10 years or so because of the nuclear deal. Because conventionally, and even through its proxies, Iran does not pose such a grave threat to Israel. Yes, it is a nuisance. It could open a second front in Syria or from Syria if there is one from Lebanon between Hezbollah and Israel. But Israel can cope with that. Regarding the exercise, it's really a headquarters exercise done by officers at their desks mostly. Of course, there are planes and ships in the air or at sea, but these are not army divisions maneuvering towards the border. Yes, there are tens of thousands in the formations involved, but they have not been called up. It's only their commanders and staff officers. Israel is trying to get in better shape to prepare for the eventuality, but it has no interest in precipitating anything now, and it has a double message. for Hezbollah and for Iran. One is that, yes, we are better prepared than we were 11 years ago, but no, we have no intentions of having a self-fulfilling prophecy, saying that war is imminent and then bringing it about.
Okay, let's ask Michael Prejean. Is it a chicken and egg thing here? Because if you're Hezbollah and your old enemy, one of the largest military-industrial complexes in the world per capita, is conducting such a drill, you're waiting for the opportunity to feel provoked by the Israelis and say, you see, you're provoking us, so we've got to prepare ourselves. Isn't that the way it works in game theory?
It's exactly how it works in game theory. I just wanted to take one point that the last speaker said. I think the Iran deal it's not a constraining thing. It doesn't constrain Iran's actions. It's actually emboldened Iran's actions. They've been more of a destabilizing force post JCPOA than they were before that. But back to your point about Hezbollah being basically tempted to react based on this Israeli military exercise. There's a new dynamic at play. Putin is actually protecting these sites. He's actually warned Netanyahu not to strike Iran or its proxies in Syria. And that's an added element here because Putin's air defense assets can actually shoot down Israeli jets. This isn't the S-300 that the Israelis have trained against. This is the S-400. This has the ability to shoot down American aircraft as well. So there's a new dynamic here. I hope, I agree with the last speaker as well that this is not an immediate threat, but we have to pay attention to what Iran's doing now, because Iran's paying attention to what the U.S. response to North Korea, in that one of our biggest deterrents to doing something against North Korea is the fact that North Korea can punish South Korea. Iran's trying to create the same capability in Syria and Lebanon to be able to punish Israel so that it's a deterrent to U.S. action against Iran.
Ksenia, let me ask you about Hassan Nasrallah. In 2006, at the time that Israel and Hezbollah went to war with each other, and invariably because of the makeup of Lebanon, it was essentially Israel going to war with almost 2/3 of Lebanon and causing a lot of destruction. The war was ugly. At that time, Nasrallah was seen as a hero throughout the Arab and Muslim world, which is, I guess, 90% Sunni. He was a hero because he was fighting the Israelis. He lost a lot of that goodwill because of the Syrian war. Hezbollah lost a lot of that goodwill by supporting Bashar al-Assad. Yeah. Do you really want to hand that back to him by giving him another war and making Hezbollah heroes of the Middle East and heroes of the broader Muslim world again?
Well, first of all, I would say I assume that nothing, even war with Israel, would not bring back to Hassan Nasrallah and to his organization that was proclaimed by Arab Sunni states, some of them as terrorist organization. Something that, for example, Russia is still reluctant to do and perhaps will never do it altogether. This is, you know, as for the perceptions and to how it's being perceived now by the Arab Sunni world. Because, you know, people are also following what Hezbollah is being involved in on the side of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, you know, and what kind of casualties it caused on the civilian population in Syria. So this is first of all. But second of all, I will also join, you know, all of the previous speakers and say, and repeat also what I said in the beginning of the program. The last thing that Israel is interested in now is a war with Hezbollah or with any other Iranian proxy in Syria or in Lebanon. However, you know, learning from the dynamics of this region, we know that almost anything can drag us into this war. For example, in 2016, in winter, we almost had an accident in which Hezbollah was shooting on our patrol next to the northern border, close to Lebanon. 2 soldiers were killed, but you know what? If 12 would be killed or 20 would be killed, God forbid, then we could find ourselves in a very nasty situation in which we would be obliged to reply. And now, with having Iran getting closer and closer to our borders, this probability grows, unfortunately.
Right. At the heart of all of this, we're hearing from both Michael and Ksenia that the Russians seem to pull the strings here when it comes to Iran's actions. And I guess that's why Israel's so frustrated that Russia's not doing anything despite their complaints. Let's listen to what Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told a news conference in the Qatari capital Doha recently. He said, "We do not have any information that someone is preparing an attack on Israel, whatever area of cooperation between Iran and Syria. My position is that if their cooperation in whichever field does not violate the basic provisions of international law, it should not be cause for question. Amir Oren, that must be driving Prime Minister Netanyahu absolutely bananas, because the Russians are saying, none of our business, stay out of our business.
Well, bananas are quite available in Israel, and they are relatively inexpensive. So Netanyahu can take some comfort in that. But some of the headlines which came out of the Putin-Netanyahu meeting were exaggerated. As far as we know, those factories, rocket factories, which the Iranians are planning to build in Lebanon in order to bypass the very successful Israeli interdiction of such munitions being transported from Syria, they are only in the planning stage. Nothing has been built yet, and Netanyahu wanted to tell Putin, to ask Putin to tell his friends in Tehran and in Beirut to stop doing whatever they had in mind. It is not an imminent danger to Israel, and therefore there is no cause for any preemptive strike here. And the questions that one should ask oneself is, what are the interests? What are the motives? Why should anyone go to war now? What is the reason for breaking the status quo? For Israel, for Russia, and perhaps for the population of Lebanon, the answer is there is no reason. If Hezbollah and Iran find some pretexts, it will be very sad for the Lebanese population, because the Israelis intend, and have declared so openly, that they will strike very forcefully from day one. They will have a short campaign, a short but massive campaign, and they will stop at that. They are not going to linger on for 30 or 60 days. And the destruction on both sides will be very unfortunate.
Michael Pregent, do you believe that this is the beginning of Iranian empire building in the region as a result of that Iran deal? I mean, Amir Oren, like others, see it as something that defangs the Iranians. You see it the other way. So are we going to see more Iranian influence?
Well, everything hinges on whether or not we give Iran access to the US dollar. I believe they've already spent the $150 billion that was unfrozen and given back to the Iranians. They're counting on investment in Iran, and that's not going to happen as long as the Revolutionary Guard has its tentacles in every aspect of Iran's economy. So Iran could actually not be able to afford to continue these things. But I still see the JCPOA as an unconstraining event, not a constraining event. And if you look at what Iran has been able to do in Iraq with its proxies and Syria, you know, the imminent threat, everybody talks about, is this an imminent threat? It's going to be a threat in the future. They're building factories, surface-to-surface missiles, to hit Israel. You don't want to be at the point we are now with North Korea, where the only options are military options with large amounts of civilian deaths. You can do something now. I just say real quick on war. An airstrike, an air campaign for 8 hours is not war, it's an air campaign. So there are other things you can do.
Okay, I got to wrap, unfortunately. I would have loved to have continued. Lots of posturing and lots of planning. We hope there won't be more war in the region. Ksenia Svetlova, Michael Pregent, and Amir Oren, I thank you all for joining us. Still ahead on the Newsmakers, a Guatemalan standoff. It's the courts versus the president in a fight over corruption. And want to get inside the mind of a militant? Our guest today says you should begin by reading their poetry. Welcome back to the Newsmakers. It's never a good look when the person in charge of investigating corruption is ordered out of the country by the president. But that's exactly what's happened in Guatemala. The UN put Ivan Velázquez in charge of looking into the campaign finances of President Jimmy Morales. But before long, he was accused of destabilizing the nation and told to leave. Morales then sacked some government ministers for failing to follow the orders. Several other officials have resigned in protest, and thousands of Guatemalans have staged a rally to demand Morales resign. So, could this political scandal cost him the presidency?
For many Guatemalans, corruption in government is starting to sound like a bad joke. And their comedian-turned-president, Jimmy Morales, is center stage. Last week, he tried to expel the UN investigator probing the accusations against him.
Confirmo mi decisión plena de declarar persona non grata al señor Iván Velázquez Gómez en su calidad de comisionado de la Comisión Internacional contra la Impunidad en Guatemala, CICIG.
Ivan Velázquez says Morales hid more than $825,000 in funding for his presidential campaign in 2015.
As party secretary, he could have received anonymous donations or omitted them from the official books.
It's a flashback to 2 years ago, when the same UN body probed former President Otto Perez. Protests lasted months and eventually forced Perez out. That year, Jimmy Morales swept to power on the slogan, "Neither corrupt nor a crook."
Políticos que de políticos no tienen nada porque son simples ladrones y embusteros.
A campaign his critics now say was funded illegally. Guatemala's constitutional court has overturned the expulsion of Velázquez and ruled to lift the president's immunity. But it's now up to Congress to decide. If 2/3 of lawmakers vote in favor, Morales could be impeached. His son and brother have already been jailed in a separate corruption investigation. Guatemala's former president couldn't escape the charges. Could Morales see the same fate? Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Guatemala City by Eduardo Stein. He's the former vice president of Guatemala and a former minister of international affairs. And from Costa Rica's capital, San Jose, Kevin Casas Zamora. He's an expert in Latin American affairs and was the former vice president of Costa Rica. He's now a senior fellow at the Washington-based think tank Inter-American Dialogue. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us. Let me start with you, Eduardo Stein. Is Jimmy Morales corrupt?
Well, this is for Congress to decide. They will form an investigative commission and they have to rule on the issue of whether his party, when he was the general secretariat of the party, received anonymous donation, which is against the electoral law in Guatemala. Many people in the streets considered him a rather serious person, although he was a comedian by trade, but throughout his less than 2 years in the presidency, that opinion has swifted and changed dramatically. And now there are lots of doubts surrounding the president.
Kevin Casas Zamora, he obviously says he's innocent. He denies any wrongdoing. Does he have a case at all?
Well, going back to your previous question, I mean, I don't know, nobody knows at this point whether Morales is corrupt, but at the very least, we know that he's not very committed to transparency. And transparency was at the core of the political platform that he ran on when he was elected a couple of years ago. So this, I think, at the very least, comes as a huge disappointment, which goes to show how, you know, these things, you know, the political pressure, the social pressure that led to the ousting of the previous president, Otto Pérez Molina, those things need a set of political leaders and a set of political institutions that are solid enough, that are of stature enough to carry this agenda in favor of transparency forward. And sadly, it looks as though Guatemala is lacking that. Is lacking the solid institutions and the able political leaders to bring this agenda in favor of transparency and integrity forward.
Eduardo, when the UN tasked Velázquez to look into the matter, and the guy comes up and says, I find something wrong, and immediately afterwards the president says, get out of the country. Do you understand that it makes the president look really guilty before anybody's really even looked at it closely? It seemed like the actions of a guilty man. Would you accept that?
Well, as the person who negotiated with the UN General Secretariat and signed the agreement between the Guatemalan government and the UN, I was convinced from the very beginning that we needed an outside mechanism and that the UN could provide that in order for strengthening our own justice system and more specifically the prosecutorial organism within our justice system. It is that very organism and it is that very mechanism provided by the UN that the president has tried to, I don't know, to set back, asking for the dismissal of its head. And of course, the reaction of the population was automatic. He is trying to kick out the very person who is investigating him.
Yeah. Kevin Casas-Zamora, the fact that these prosecutors need 2/3 of Congress in order to push through this formal investigation, and if they want to see, if they want to see Jimmy Morales really face the music, 2/3 of Congress has to agree. And the fact that many opposition members and many members of Congress are also under scrutiny, does that suggest to you that this isn't going to happen because Code of Omerta, let's just close ranks and not open up the gates of hell for us all to possibly lose our jobs? Is that what's going to happen?
I don't know, but it's a possibility. You know, it's not a done deal that he's going to be impeached over this. But the trump card in all this is social pressure, and I think there's a lot of it in Guatemala. I don't think the social pressure that led to the ousting of previous President Otto Perez has simply vanished, has simply gone away. I mean, that's still there. I mean, there's a social demand that sustains whatever the International Commission Against Impunity is doing in Guatemala. I think they have a lot of support. And they have a lot of support. The CC has a lot of support for the same sort of reason that whenever they run an opinion poll in Europe, people in places like Italy are more likely to support the European Union. So that kind of support is not likely to go away, and that's a big problem for the president and for the political elite in Guatemala in general, should they choose to close ranks and protect the president.
Eduardo, are we going to see this escalate on the ground where the people push back?
Well, the population is divided because there are several sectors who are appreciating the work of Mr. Iván Velázquez, but there are others who question his impartiality in investigating some cases and not investigating others. We have now like a three-ring circus. On the one hand, there is the direct confrontation between the president and the attorney general, who is a lady that supports all out the activity of Mr. Velázquez. On the other hand, there is a negotiating option that is awaiting for the answer of the Office of the General Secretary of the UN so that they can revise the way in which this International Commission Against Impunity has performed in Guatemala. And thirdly, there is the population at large who is claiming for deep down structural reforms that this government, that this Congress, and that this judiciary don't seem to be willing to take up.
Eduardo, are the institutions strong enough for the Supreme Court to actually provide a check on the executive?
Well, part of the problem that triggered the request to the UN to bring this international commission to Guatemala was precisely the weakness of the institutions and the failing of the three powers of the state to check on each other. And we didn't have, and we still don't have, a good check and balances system. Now, the whole issue is in the hands of Congress, and we very much doubt that it's going to be an easy thing to solve, because there are several other parties who are being investigated for the very same reason, for accepting illegal money during the campaign.
So, Kevin, the fact that opposition members are also in the spotlight here, does it open up the situation to a sort of political whataboutery, where you can have the president's supporters say, well, everybody's dirty, everybody's guilty? We saw something similar in Brazil, I think, where you had Dilma supporters saying, but Temer is guilty, but everybody's guilty, why are you picking on us? Does it risk going down that rabbit hole in Guatemala?
It's very possible. I think that Eduardo was alluding to something that is critical here, which is the issue of campaign finance. You know, it's very difficult to find someone who has the high moral ground when it comes to campaign finance in Guatemala or anywhere else in Latin America, to be honest. So that's an issue that when it gets probed by investigators, that tends to generate a very strong pushback from the political elite, because ultimately most political actors engage in shenanigans when it comes to campaign finance. So it's very likely that this is the sort of issue that would favor a collective action of the political class against any kind of accountability. It was different in the case of Otto Pérez Molina, the previous president, because it was a very specific corruption scandal that did him in. In this case, we may be looking into something broader that may implicate many more political actors, and as such might make the impeachment of President Morales less likely.
Eduardo, let me ask you then, because Kevin has mentioned a few times, he's spoken about political elites, a political class. He suggested that when it comes to campaign finance, everybody's guilty, everybody's bent the rules or cooked the books along the way. My first part of the question is, are you a member of the political elite or the political class? And is it true? Have you all been cooking the books and bending the rules over the years?
First of all, I have never belonged to any political party. I was called in for my first service as foreign minister by an established party, but I was never a member of it and never became one. And when I was called in to be a vice presidential candidate, the situation was the same. And I believe that this independence from any political party allowed me to perform some of the tasks that the Constitution places on the vice presidency, mainly on the service of indigenous communities in Guatemala, which are grossly misrepresented in the political elites. Secondly, all of the parties that participated in the 2015 general elections are being investigated at the request of the International Commission Against Impunity by the General Attorney's Office. So it's not an investigation that is earmarked to the official party or to the three largest parties in the country. Everyone is being investigated on account of that, and we as a population are requesting that the electoral law be drastically reformed on account of those findings.
Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure learning from both of you and getting some insight into the political culture of Guatemala. Eduardo Stein and Kevin Casas Zamora, I thank you both for joining us.
الصخر رميناهم بكل فتى هزبر باسل حر أبابيل الهدى جاءت بسجيل من الصخر رميناهم بكل فتى هزبر باسل حر هزبر باسل حر.
It's an ancient form of storytelling that's being used for modern and violent action. Poetry, in the form of songs, is often overlooked as an important recruiting tool for terror groups like Daesh and Al-Qaeda. That's according to perhaps the world's foremost expert on what she calls jihadist poetry. It's an unusual title that belongs to a woman with unique expertise. Her name is Elisabeth Kendall, and she spent years studying and translating poetry in publications linked to militants. Her work's taken her all the way to remote tribal areas in Yemen. She says the poetry provides a glimpse into the mentality of terrorists and can help explain why their ideology flourishes. Well, her official title is a Senior Research Fellow in Arabic and Islamic Studies at Oxford University's Pembroke College. Elisabeth Kendall joins me now from Oslo. It's great to talk to you. Elisabeth, you have a unique approach. Tell me why you do what you do.
Well, thank you for asking me. I do what I do because I feel it's a very neglected field. In the West and in intelligence organizations, even in academic organizations, we tend to focus very heavily on the military aspects of jihadist groups or on what they think doctrinally, but we focus less on how the message actually spreads. And I was fascinated to note that about 1 in 5 pages of some, or most magazines of militant jihadist groups actually contain poetry. Yes, it was being skipped over. Now, it wouldn't just be there for fun, it must be there for a purpose. And so I set out to discover what that was.
And help me explain how this helps us combat extremism. What can we learn from it to help us put an end to terror?
Well, I think what it does is it gives us a glimpse into the hearts and minds of militant jihadists, and also enables us to understand better how they, in turn, secure support, or at least just toleration, and how they win hearts and minds. So it's not just about trying to fight movements by working out how they're using their weapons, what their operational tactics are. It's about working out how they win over local populations. And the poetry does tell us something about that. There are many different functions that the poetry performs. And I think there's also a practical aspect that one shouldn't forget, which is that the poetry stays in the collective memory. It's not just written, it's oral as well.
I haven't read any of their poetry, but having listened to some of the nasheeds or the religious music, and having come across like the Quranic recitation that is attached to some of the videos, whether it's Al-Qaeda or Daesh, I always felt that people often underestimate just how much of a focus they have on the aesthetics of it all. The fact that these things are filmed beautifully, the music, the lyrical nature of it is really beautiful. Tell me how important the aesthetics are to winning over new recruits and sort of drawing people in.
Well, I think they're very important. And one of the reasons for that is that, as I said, it hangs around in the memory, it's catchy, it's easy to pass on. You don't need print media, you don't even need the internet, it travels on the wind. And of course, when websites are taken down or Twitter feeds are taken down, the poetry just lives on. And what it does is it's not really trying to argue a case. The poetry is distilling an idea into a very, very simple black and white image of the world as good guys and bad guys, in a way that resonates. Right. So, for example, in Yemen, where I do most of my work, I undertook a survey and found out that 74% of the population considers poetry either important or very important in their daily lives. So it's no surprise that the jihadist movements are using this. They can provoke passion, they can paint an alternative reality from the one that we see on our TV screens. they can truly address hearts and minds. And I'm happy to give you some examples if you'd like some.
Give me one example. Go ahead.
OK, so here's an example of recreating the power rush of a suicide bomber. This would be recited. It would also be easily converted into a nasheed, into an anthem, as you mentioned earlier. So I'll give it to you in Arabic first, and then I'll tell you what it says. سأشد حزامي الناسف وانتفض كبرق خاطف وأمر كالسيل جارف. I mean, you can hear the lilt, the rhythm. And those lines are basically saying, I fasten my suicide belt, I rush by like a torrential stream, I shudder like a lightning bolt. It's very clever because it peps you up, it provokes passion. And it also uses the ancient desert natural imagery from pre-Islamic poetry, which would resonate so strongly in a tribal environment.
Right. It's interesting because in the build-up to talking with you, we played a little clip of a nasheed where there's a kind of reference to Surah Al-Fil in the Quran. You know, very important here, very important moment in Islamic history. So ordinary believers consider this important, and then you have this kind of cannibalizing of it by these groups. So they talk about sort of considering themselves the stones or the birds that went and destroyed the army that was attacking Mecca, right? How much of that do we see where they kind of draw from the well of the tradition and take their own thing out of it and turn to their followers and say, you see, we are the true heirs of this heritage. We have the proper interpretation. Our fight is the fight that began 1,400 years ago. Do we see a lot of that sort of thing happening?
We do, and you've hit on a very important point here, which is that the jihadist groups today mine the oral tradition, the classical poetic tradition, and lift from it whatever suits. And it's very clever because you'll find that audiences might just be slightly familiar with a poem because it's been passed down through the generations orally or because they learnt it at school. And yet, sandwiched onto it might be something new. By these jihadist groups, they might use an old line that people would recognise and then say something like, talk about, let's say, burning towers in the city, swapped in for burning trees in the desert. And of course, that would make it seem as though something like bringing the Twin Towers down on 9/11 was predestined. So it's a very powerful tool of manipulation. And in my work, I actually discovered that over 50% of the poetry used by Al-Qaeda in Yemen was traceable to the poetic tradition. So that's quite astonishing. Even poems that we thought were penned today, in fact, were not. But they're put into a context of modern-day terror acts to give them extra legitimacy, to authenticate them.
Tell me if I'm wrong in finding a parallel with some of the new far-right movements and the alt-right movements that we're seeing around the world, because you have a lot of young, disaffected men. Maybe they have a sense of victimhood. They feel as if they've lost something great in their past, in their culture, their civilization, and they connect with these kind of memes, right? Sometimes it's a very simple internet meme, and other times it's something deeper in, I guess, the Richard Dawkins sense. It's an idea where they connect with ideas of kind of medieval chivalry, and they quote Richard the Lionheart, and they glorify the Crusades and stuff, because we're seeing a lot of that sort of stuff emerge in the United States and elsewhere. Is that a similar thing that's happening, and can we maybe draw parallels between these two movements?
Well, I think you can certainly draw parallels in terms of the search for a lost identity, the desire to go deep into the roots of what you consider to be your authentic culture. In that sense, there are parallels. And I think the nasheeds, the anthems, are particularly resonant for groups of disaffected Muslim youths, perhaps on their way to radicalization in the West. But inside the Arab world itself, inside the Middle East, I do believe that poetry has a special place that perhaps it doesn't have here. And that may be why it's been overlooked for such a long time. It might come as no surprise to you, or it might be a surprise to learn that one of their biggest TV shows in the Arab world is a version of Pop Idol or American Idol or Britain's Got Talent, and it's about poetry. It's Poetry Idol. It's about picking the best poet. So it has over 70 million viewers. So that just gives you a sense for how powerful poetry still remains today.
Elisabeth Kendall, it was super talking to you. I hope you'll come back on the program. We need to chat some more, but I've got a wrap for now. Thanks so much for joining us.
Inshallah.
That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Next time, should the violence against Rohingya Muslims be considered genocide? We'll have that debate. Until then, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.